I'm Eric Cohen with Gardner and Caparelli CPAs to discuss PPP forgiveness FAQs. So today we're going to talk about what documentation is needed for PPP forgiveness. So let's jump into it. The first question I keep getting from clients is, should I include all eligible expenses during the cover period? The short answer is no. Only include what is needed to achieve full forgiveness. Now, for some companies, they will need to include all eligible expenses during the cover period. But for most companies, they will only need to provide one or two expense lines in order to achieve full forgiveness. Now let's look at an example on screen. This company received an original PPP loan for $100,000. During the cover period, 8 or 24 weeks, they spent the following on eligible expenses totaling $207,000. Now, it is completely unnecessary and a lot more work to provide the documents claiming all $207,000 of eligible expenses. And why? You only need $100,000 worth of eligible expenses to achieve the full forgiveness. So, in this example, you can just provide the payroll wage line and ignore everything else, which should significantly reduce the amount of time and effort gathering documents. Now remember, you need a minimum of 60% spent on payroll to achieve full forgiveness. So always start there with payroll expenses. Let's look at another example. Here, everything is the same, but now we only spent $90,000 on payroll. So, what should we claim here? Well, there's a few options. First and always, let's start with payroll, salary, and wages, which gets you the $90,000. You could then just provide retirement and health insurance, which should get you over the original loan amount. Or you could just provide payroll, wages, and rent expense, which also gets you there. You can even just do payroll, wages, and mortgage interest. Which combination is better? Well, as long as you have at least 60% payroll, it really doesn't matter. What you should be considering is which documents are most readily available and limits the burden for providing the support. Personally, I find payroll, salary, and wages, and the rent expense to be the easiest. But that's my situation. The only time you should be pulling the support and claiming all eligible expenses is if you need all of them to accumulate to the original PPP loan amount. So, now that we understand that we don't need to claim and pull support for every single eligible expense, let's dive into what we will need. So, let's start with payroll costs and what documents will be required. This will be applicable to basically everyone, unless you're a sole proprietor or independent contractor without payroll, which we'll get to later. So, you will need to provide 3 items for cash compensation payroll cost. The first item will be a third-party payroll report like Gusto, ADP, or Paychex. This should show each employee individually and only during the cover period or alternative cover period if elected. If you do not use a third party and run payroll yourself, prepare an internal payroll report the same way and also have bank statements available supporting those payments. You may need an Excel reconciliation for the third-party report for what actually eligible to be claimed if the report doesn't indicate this already. So, for example, if you have highly compensated employees who are limited to the annualized $100,000 cap, or certain employees who are not US based, or special caps for owners, you should have this reconciliation tying back from the third party report to what's actually going to be claimed as eligible expenses on your forgiveness application. The second item needed is a quarterly 941 federal filing. And for the most applicable quarters that occurred during the covered period, so you're most likely talking about Q2 and Q3 of 2020. The third and last thing you're going to need is the state quarterly filings. For example, in New York, it's the NY 45s. Okay, so if you're also claiming any non-cash compensation like health insurance or retirement match, you will need the following documents: a payment receipt, a canceled check, and or an account statement to prove that it was actually paid within the covered period as well as for whom it was for. Reminder, this is only for the employer's expense, so it should not include any payments made for the employee's retirement or health insurance, just the employer's contribution. So you will need to break that out if the payment is made altogether, which it typically is. Remember, you are just gathering the support for what you are actually claiming expenses for. So if you're not claiming any non-cash compensation, don't sweat it and don't worry about it. Next, let's talk about the documents needed for non-payroll costs, such as interest expense, rent, and utilities. First off, for all of these non-payroll costs, you will need to provide support that you had these items in place by February 2020 or earlier in order to be eligible. So, for mortgage interest expense, you will need to provide 1, an amortization schedule, and 2, a canceled check or account statement for both the covered period and February 2020 or earlier. For rent expenses, you will need to provide 1, the lease agreement, and 2, either a receipt, canceled check, or the lessor's account statement for both the covered period and February 2020 or earlier. And lastly, for utility expenses, you will need to provide 1, invoices during the covered period and February 2020 or earlier, and 2, the receipt, canceled check, or statement providing support that payment was made. Again, a reminder, you only need to provide the support for the expenses needed to claim to achieve full forgiveness. And lastly, if you're required to complete the long form 3508 opposed to the EZ or S simple forms, you will need to provide support for the forgiveness reduction calculations. Now, this is only applicable if you're required to use the long form when applying for forgiveness. This will require you to provide the applicable support for Appendix A, including the wage/hourly reduction and the FTE reduction. You should have a workbook, most likely in Excel, supporting your calculations as well as any source documents you used. For example, you should have payroll or hourly reports from the third party or internal that was used for these calculations. If you're claiming any safe harbors, expect to provide supporting documentation for this as well. For example, if you're claiming for the FTE reduction that you provided a good faith written offer to rehire employees during the cover period but was rejected, well, you should have this written letter available as well as the employee's rejection. In addition to that, you should also have a letter from you sent to the unemployment insurance office within 30 days of the employee's refusal, notifying them of this. In addition, if you're claiming that there are any terminations for cause, or maybe an employee voluntarily resigned, you should also have strong HR documentation supporting these claims. Lastly, if you're either self-employed, an independent contractor, or a sole proprietor, and you have no employees or payroll, you are in luck. The documents required should be a light lift. You will need to provide your 2019 tax return, which is what should have been provided during the original application. Also note, you are most likely eligible for the SBA forgiveness application 3508S, or the simple application. Thanks everyone. I hope you are now ready to gather the supporting documentation required for the PPP forgiveness application. Feel free to check out our website, gardnerandcaparelli.com, where we have additional resources within our blog section. Stay safe, everyone. Thanks.